Welcome to the drawing room detectives, where gas lamps flicker, gears hum quietly in hidden workshops, and the unmatched mind of Sherlock Holmes never sleeps. Today we dust off the pages of a strange and secretive case. It begins not with a scream in the night or a locked door, but with a machine, half-built, brass-faced, and eerily still. Before we begin, where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoy atmospheric mysteries, ticking dangers, and the enduring brilliance of Sherlock Holmes, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss a case. Now settle in. The gears are winding, the gas lamps are lit, and something strange is stirring in the darkened corners of the future. Chapter 1. The Widow's Visit. It was on a sullen March morning, with rain flecking the windows of Baker Street and the faint scent of coal smoke drifting in from the chimney pots, that we received a most unusual visitor. I had been engaged with the morning paper, and Holmes, sunk in his armchair, was busy with his chemical experiments, muttering absently over a test tube which issued small threads of pale blue smoke. A firm knock sounded upon our door, not hurried, but with that precise rhythm which always signalled, to Holmes's discerning ear, a person of decision rather than distress. "Someone neither hysterical nor hesitant," Holmes murmured, without glancing up. "Likely a woman of standing. Let us hope she brings a matter worthy of the damp walk I took through Regent's Park this morning." Mrs. Hudson ushered in a lady dressed in a widow's black, her veil drawn but not obscuring the fine bones of her face. She was tall and carried herself with a natural grace that time and sorrow had not quite subdued. Her eyes, a clear grey, settled at once upon Holmes. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" she asked. "I am, madam, and this is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray, be seated. You appear to have something upon your mind that no mere expression of condolence could ease." The woman took the proffered chair, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "My name is Mrs. Evelyn Langford," she began. "I am the widow of Elias Langford, the inventor. You may have read of his passing last week." Holmes gave a slight incline of the head. "A cardiac event, if I recall. A sad loss to the field of mechanical design." "Yes," she said, her voice tight. "That is what the doctor called it. But there is something else, something I must show you. I would not be here otherwise." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded slip of cream paper. Holmes took it with slender fingers and unfolded it. I leaned forward slightly to read over his shoulder. Scrawled upon the paper in a jagged typeface, clearly produced by some mechanical means, were the words, "E. Langford shall expire in the night, alone beneath brass and silence." Holmes said nothing, but his brows knit. He held the paper close, examined the indentations, then set it upon the table. "This was printed by a machine?" "Yes," she said. "By the very automaton my husband was building. He called it the Mechanical Prophet. It was to be the crown of his life's work, a machine capable of rational analysis, perhaps even prediction. Mere days before his death, it began printing out messages like this, each more strange than the last. He laughed at them at first, but then this one came. And that same night he died, in his workshop, just as it said. I found him slumped beside the machine, alone, and—" her voice caught. "Beneath the brass casing he had been fitting. The house was silent. I remember thinking how it echoed." Holmes steepled his fingers. "Forgive me, Mrs. Langford, but are you suggesting the automaton predicted your husband's death?" "I do not know what I believe, Mr. Holmes," she replied. "But there have been more messages. They continue to appear, one by one. Some seem nonsensical, others—" She hesitated, then reached into her bag again and retrieved 3 more slips of paper. Holmes examined each, reading aloud in a slow, detached tone. "The banker shall bleed beneath glass and gold. The beast walks trailing smoke and song. The crown shall weep in Windsor's shadow. He laid the slips down and looked to me. Curious phrasing. Vague enough to be interpreted in 100 ways, yet disturbingly specific in tone. I felt a chill rise in me. Surely this is some prank, a trick of the mechanism or a fabrication? Holmes looked back to Mrs. Langford. Who, aside from yourself, has access to the machine? No one now. I had it locked away after Elias died, but before that, well, anyone close to him might have. His assistant left 2 months prior. He was working alone. Holmes stood, his eyes bright with interest. Mrs. Langford, I should very much like to see this automaton for myself. May I call upon you this afternoon? She nodded, relief softening her features. Please do. I cannot sleep with it in the house, Mr. Holmes. It feels watchful, as though it waits for something. Holmes turned to me as she departed. Well, Watson, we have been called upon to investigate a prophecy made by a machine. Let us see whether it proves a hoax, a trick of gears and gaslight, or something more dangerous still. I could not help but feel that the matter, far from being mere superstition, was already working its way under my skin. There was something about those coldly printed words, as though the voice of reason itself had been twisted into a whisper of dread. Chapter 2. The Prophet in the Parlor. It was a grey and mist-hung afternoon when Holmes and I journeyed to the Langford estate in Hampstead. The drizzle had ceased, yet the trees drooped with moisture, and the gravel beneath our boots gave off a soft crunch as we approached the modest but dignified residence. A single chimney smoked faintly above the slate roof, and a black sash still hung from the brass knocker in mourning. Mrs. Langford met us at the door. She had removed her veil but still wore black, and though her manner remained composed, I detected an anxious tension in her every gesture. The machine remains where he left it, she said quietly, leading us inside. I have not allowed the servants to touch it. Not even to dust. Holmes gave a slight nod of approval. Prudent. May I ask when it last produced a message? This morning, she replied. It had been still for 2 days. Then I heard the winding noise again. She led us through a narrow hallway adorned with framed engineering sketches and into a parlor at the rear of the house. The room was dark despite the hour, its curtains drawn halfway, and the hearth lay cold. At the center of the floor stood the automaton. It was taller than I had expected, a humanoid construction of brass, wood, and glass tubes. Its chest was open, revealing a series of clockwork gears and copper coils, while its face, molded in an approximation of human features, was oddly expressive. The lips parted slightly as if on the verge of speech. A length of paper curled from a slot at the base of its chest and trailed to the floor, printed in neat black letters. Holmes circled it slowly, hands clasped behind his back. A remarkable piece of craftsmanship, he murmured. Langford was no mere tinkerer. See how the jaw is connected to a phonographic diaphragm, and how the ticker tape is fed by twin barrels. A mechanical oracle indeed. I found myself strangely unsettled by the thing. It stood like a mannequin in reverie, yet there was a strange dignity to its pose, as though it were waiting for an audience. Holmes crouched and examined the innards of the machine with his magnifying glass. After a few moments he reached into his coat and produced a pair of fine tweezers. "Note this, Watson," he said, beckoning me closer. "These wires here, connecting the message spool to the mainspring. See the nick upon the copper?" I peered in. Yes, it appears to have been scored deliberately. Exactly. And here, some residue upon the gear teeth, graphite or something like it, deliberately introduced to cause uneven movement. He turned to Mrs. Langford. "Do you recall whether your husband had difficulty with the machine before these predictions began?" She hesitated. He mentioned it hesitating, pausing mid-operation. Once it stopped entirely, and he had to recalibrate the release springs. He said it was as though it were thinking, though of course he was only joking. Holmes straightened and dusted his fingers with a handkerchief. This mechanism has been tampered with, and with knowledge of its design. Someone wished to alter its function in a subtle, deceptive fashion, not to break it, but to influence what it would produce. You believe someone used it to frighten my husband? Or to frighten others through him? Tell me, was anyone present in the house the night he died? No, I was away visiting my sister in Kensington. He had insisted I go. The housekeeper was dismissed early, and the gardener had left before dusk. Holmes paced slowly before the machine. Too convenient to be coincidence. Either your husband feared for his life and wished you away, or someone arranged it thus to act undisturbed. A sound interrupted us then, sharp and mechanical. The automaton whirred softly, and a clicking within its chest began. I stepped back involuntarily. The ticker tape unspooled with a faint chattering sound, and out came a fresh strip of paper curling gently to the floor. Holmes caught it before it landed and read aloud. "The lion shall be cut beneath the laurels." Holmes held the paper up to the light. It prints by command or by some timed trigger, a primitive program perhaps, but with deliberate inputs. "Is it a real prophecy?" Mrs. Langford asked, her voice hushed. Holmes turned to her, his eyes keen. "No machine may predict the future, madam, save by deceit or design. Our task now is to learn which and why." He turned back to the automaton and placed a hand lightly on its shoulder. "Come, Watson, let us examine the workshop. If this mechanical prophet speaks lies, it must have learned them from a human tongue." And with that, we left the parlor, the soft curl of the tape still hanging like a whisper in the silence behind us. Chapter 3: The Engineer's Notebook. The Langford workshop was a curious blend of order and chaos, a place where the rigours of scientific inquiry appeared to war with the obsessions of a singular mind. The room was housed in a separate wing of the estate, accessible only by a narrow corridor lined with shelves of patent folios and obscure German texts. Holmes paused at the threshold, sniffed the air, and stepped in as one might enter a shrine or a crime scene, cautious, alert, and entirely without reverence. A broad workbench dominated the centre of the room, strewn with gears, levers, coils, and tools of the watchmaker's trade. Diagrams were pinned to the walls with brass tacks, each meticulously annotated in a fine, slanting hand. A mechanical arm rested half-completed on a velvet cloth, and beside it a tin of solder still sat open, the surface dulled with age. "Langford was a methodical man," he murmured. "These volumes are numbered. Let us hope he maintained the same rigour in his private writings." After a brief inspection, Holmes removed the final notebook, volume 12, and laid it upon the workbench. The cover was worn at the corners, the leather soft from use. He opened it gently, and we both leaned in. The first pages were filled with precise technical illustrations. Pistons, pulleys, and schematic diagrams of mechanical linkages filled the folios, each labelled in Langford's careful script. There were equations written in ink, margins filled with trial adjustments, and the occasional exclamation, "I must try copper instead," or voice modulation needs delay coil adjustment. As we progressed, the entries took on a more speculative tone. Langford had begun to philosophize about intelligence, noting patterns, decision trees, and the possibility of mechanical deduction. "He was trying to simulate reasoning," I remarked, "like a chess-playing automaton, only with words instead of moves." "Indeed," Holmes replied, "but observe, there, near the end." He turned to a page where the ink was darker, as if applied with unusual pressure. The handwriting here was looser, more hurried. Across the top of the page was scrawled the word private. Holmes read aloud. The prophet grows inconsistent. It prints words I did not program, phrases with double meaning. I begin to suspect it builds from prior outputs, assembling speech beyond its instruction. If this is true, then it may no longer be a tool, but a mask behind which something else acts. It knows more than I told it. Below this final line, the paper bore evidence of removal, cleanly torn from the binding. A page had been excised, not ripped in haste, but carefully, as if the contents had been too dangerous or damning to leave behind. Holmes tapped the edge of the torn page thoughtfully. This is the last entry. The rest of the notebook is blank. It would seem Langford feared something. Not the machine itself, perhaps, but the implications of its behavior. Holmes slipped the journal into his coat pocket. I shall study this more fully tonight. There may be faint indentations upon the torn leaf. If so, they may yield to graphite shading or reagent vapor. He turned to the bench and began to examine the tools. Note also, Watson, the careful alignment of these implements. Nothing here has been taken in haste. Langford worked until the end, then left of his own volition, perhaps to rest, perhaps to die. A clock on the mantel chimed 4 times. Mrs. Langford entered quietly a moment later, bearing a silver tray with tea. She looked to the notebook in Holmes's hand, but said nothing. You were kind to preserve the room as it was, Holmes said. Tell me, did your husband ever express concern about someone stealing his work? Not stealing, she said, setting the tray down, but Elias spoke of rivals, one in particular, Dr. Venn. They had once worked together years ago, but the partnership ended bitterly. Holmes exchanged a glance with me. And where might we find Dr. Venn now? He runs a laboratory in Clerkenwell. Elias said he had grown theatrical in recent years, too enamored with public demonstrations and seances. Holmes allowed himself a faint smile. An inventor turned showman. That sort of vanity often leaves fingerprints. He turned back to the workshop, taking one last look around the room, as if committing every gear and cog to memory. Then he nodded, and we departed. As we stepped once more into the gathering mist of Hampstead, I asked, Do you truly believe this machine can think? Holmes gave a rare pause. I believe, Watson, that it was made to give the appearance of thought, but if a clever man wished to deceive the public, perhaps even frighten them, he could do no better than to clothe his mischief in the skin of prophecy. He drew his collar against the wind. Let us find this Dr. Venn. I suspect he knows more of prophecy than he lets on. Chapter 4. The Second Prediction. That evening found us once again ensconced in our sitting room at Baker Street, the rain having returned in steady sheets against the windows. A small fire crackled in the grate, and the scent of pipe tobacco hung in the air like incense at a ritual. Holmes, with sleeves rolled to the elbow, sat hunched over the Langford journal upon his desk, surrounded by a precise chaos of scrap paper, magnifying lens and chemical vials. The man's mind was ordered but not rigid, Holmes observed, tapping the edge of the notebook. There is a fluidity to his reasoning, a willingness to explore improbable premises. This entry in particular, where he notes the automaton producing its own syntax, suggests he suspected interference but could not prove it. You mean to say someone tampered with the mechanism while convincing him it was functioning of its own accord? I asked. Precisely. And consider this, Watson. The missing page, torn cleanly as we noted, may have contained the identity of the person he suspected, or perhaps a message the machine produced that frightened him beyond reason. Before I could reply, we were interrupted by the sharp buzz of the front doorbell, followed shortly by the brisk steps of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. She entered with a note upon a silver tray. "This came by express messenger not 10 minutes ago, Mr. Holmes, from Mrs. Langford." Holmes opened it and read quickly. His expression did not change, but he handed the slip to me. The message was brief. Another message printed. It reads, "The banker shall bleed beneath glass and gold. I fear this may not be coincidence. E. Langford." Holmes stood and retrieved his coat. "Watson, I must see the machine tonight while the gears are still warm. There is a rhythm to its workings, and I would know if the intervals are consistent or prompted. Will you accompany me?" "Of course," I said, already reaching for my hat. But by the time we arrived once more at the Langford home, now cloaked in fog and quiet as the grave, the machine had already fallen silent. The latest strip of ticker tape was still attached to the spool, and Holmes examined it with care under lamplight. "Same typeface, no irregularity in spacing. The spools have been recently wound," he murmured. "Yet Mrs. Langford assures me she has not touched it." He stooped and inspected the floor beneath the automaton, then the carpet behind it. "The legs have shifted slightly. Someone has been here, likely no more than an hour before the message printed. We are not chasing ghostly predictions, Watson. We are chasing someone who wishes them to appear so." Despite the eerie stillness of the parlor and the mechanical prophet looming in the half-shadow, Holmes seemed more invigorated than unsettled. The following morning brought with it a most remarkable turn of events. I had barely set down my teacup when Holmes, already dressed and reading the Times, made a sound between amusement and satisfaction. "Ah," he said, tapping the paper. "The show begins." He handed the paper to me, his finger resting upon a small column halfway down the front page. I read aloud. "Accident at the Bank of England. During a scheduled address to members of the board, a section of decorative skylight above the grand rotunda collapsed unexpectedly. Sir Thomas Penworthy, Director of Financial Affairs, sustained a laceration to the scalp from falling glass and was treated on site. Witnesses report a shower of gilt-plated fragments. No other injuries reported." "The banker," I said slowly, "beneath glass and gold." Holmes smiled without mirth. "Just vague enough to suggest coincidence, yet precise enough to trouble the credulous. The sort of message a spiritualist would call meaningful, and a rationalist would call chance. But it cannot be dismissed, Holmes. The timing is uncanny." "That is exactly the intention," he said. "Someone is counting upon a public appetite for mystery. If we are correct in suspecting Venn, then this event will serve him well. A frightened public is easily led." He picked up the Langford Journal once more and flicked to the blank-end pages. "The answer lies between these covers, I am certain. What Langford built was impressive, but it was still a machine. Someone is playing ventriloquist to its brass tongue." Holmes looked toward the window where fog still clung to the panes. "And now they have chosen a grander stage, Watson. The Bank of England is no casual theatre. I suspect their next act will aim even higher." Chapter 5. The Club of Futurists. It was on the third day, following the Langford prediction, that Holmes expressed his desire to investigate what he termed the intellectual soil from which the mechanical prophet had grown. He had, through one of his more obscure contacts at the Patent Office, secured a list of Elias Langford's known correspondents and professional acquaintances. Chief among them was a private assembly called the Club of Futurists, a loosely knit circle of philosophers, tinkerers, engineers, and men of speculative science who met fortnightly in a rented hall off Gower Street. "I find," Holmes remarked, as we rode by cab through the smoke-dimmed streets, "that men of genius are often accompanied by a retinue of parasites, rivals, and disciples, some more dangerous than others. The Club of Futurists may be little more than a drinking society for well-read mechanics, but within it I expect to find at least one man with motive, means, and a certain theatrical flair. We arrived shortly before 8 at a building that might once have been a chapel, now converted into a reading hall and lecture space. The gas lamps within burned low, casting long shadows across the patterned tiles. A man at the door, sporting a velvet waistcoat and pince-nez, admitted us with only a moment's scrutiny after Holmes presented a handwritten note from Mrs. Langford. Inside, the gathering was already underway. A dozen or so men, most in cravats stained with ink or powder, stood in clusters, engaged in spirited conversation. Tables were cluttered with apparatus, journals, and steaming cups of coffee. The air was thick with the scent of oil and lamp black. One of the men, tall and thin with swept-back silver hair, turned sharply at the sound of our entrance. He was perhaps 50, with a long face that might have belonged to a carving of an Athenian judge had it not been marred by a slightly theatrical sneer. Holmes moved toward him at once. "Dr. Venn, I presume?" The man gave a stiff bow. "You have the advantage, sir. Sherlock Holmes. I am making inquiries into the late Elias Langford and hoped you might provide some insight." "Langford," Venn repeated as if tasting something sour. "A name that still lingers, though his inventions will not. I suppose the melodrama surrounding his machine has brought you here? You were colleagues at one time." "Briefly," said Venn, leading us to a nearby table. "We collaborated on a programmable loom, an elegant thing really, but parted ways before the patent was filed. Langford made certain our names would not share the documents. He was clever, but selfish. His so-called profit was a parlor toy, nothing more. And yet, it seems to have caught the imagination of the press," Holmes said mildly. "It has even been credited with forecasting tragedy." Venn gave a dry laugh. "So I have heard. Riddles printed by a clockwork doll. The world always clings to mysticism when faced with mechanism. Langford was no prophet. He was a man of nervous temperament, easily deceived by the illusions of his own mind." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Did you see the automaton after it was completed?" "No, I declined the invitation. I had no wish to see a grotesque mannequin sputter nonsense into the air. Langford loved such things. He believed machines could think. Nonsense, of course. A machine can imitate logic, but it cannot possess it." As Venn spoke, I noted how his hands trembled slightly with each sip from his cup, and how his eyes never quite met Holmes's. He wore the air of a man long accustomed to being overlooked, who now enjoyed any opportunity to diminish the achievements of a more celebrated peer. "Still," Holmes said, "you seem very well acquainted with its workings for someone who dismissed it entirely." Venn's smile faltered just for a moment. "I read the technical papers. Langford was not discreet. He published fragments in obscure journals, hoping to attract praise. I suppose you will now ask if I had reason to wish him ill." "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But I will ask this. Where were you on the evening of March 11th? "I was here," Venn said, his tone sharpening. "Giving a lecture on harmonic resonance in synthetic speech. You may inquire with Mr. Pell, the club's secretary. He has the records. I am not in the habit of creeping into men's homes to tamper with toys." Holmes inclined his head. "No, I imagine your talents lie elsewhere." As we left the club, I ventured, "Do you suspect him?" Holmes was silent a moment. Then he said, "I suspect he is a man whose pride is greater than his patience, a dangerous combination when paired with technical skill. But for now, he remains only a figure of interest. We must find out if he had access to Langford's home or knowledge of the machine's inner workings beyond the printed word." He paused at the foot of the stairs, glancing back at the flickering gaslights of the club hall. "Men like Venn do not simply fade into the background, Watson. They wait, they brood, and when the stage is set, they emerge precisely where they believe the audience will be watching. Chapter 6. The Clockmaker's Trail. The fog had lifted somewhat by the following morning, giving way to a pale, colourless sky that hung above the city like an old bedsheet. Holmes was up early, having risen before 7, and had already devoured 2 cups of strong coffee before I joined him. "Watson," he said, setting aside his untouched slice of toast, "do you recall the gear assembly within the automaton's chest, the differential pivots and the triple spring relay?" "Vaguely," I replied. "You commented on the precision of the copper teeth." "Exactly. Such components are not standard in English manufacture. The design is continental, almost certainly Swiss. There are few in London who could craft such things, and fewer still with access to the tools required." He handed me a small brass fragment, wrapped in linen. I retrieved this from the prophet's lower cavity. Note the hallmark, Delacourt and Hecht, a Swiss firm of no small reputation. "Then you suspect Langford purchased these directly?" "I rather suspect someone else did, and more recently. We shall pay a visit to the one man in London whose reputation for horological excellence extends both to society and to science, Monsieur Theodore Blay of Clerkenwell." By midday we found ourselves in Hatton Garden, where the jewellers and instrument makers crowded their wares into low-windowed shops, and the air smelled faintly of oil, iron filings, and polish. Holmes led us through a narrow alley into a well-kept establishment whose sign bore only a gilt watch face and the words "Blay Precision Horology." Inside, the air ticked with the sound of dozens of small clocks, each marking time with exquisite discipline. Behind a glass counter sat a man of neat stature with silver-rimmed spectacles and the dainty hands of a surgeon or pianist. "Monsieur Blay?" Holmes asked. The man inclined his head. "At your service, monsieur." Holmes produced the brass gear from his pocket and laid it upon the velvet counter. "May I inquire whether this component came from your workshop?" Blay took it with evident interest, turned it twice, then nodded. "Oui, c'est à moi. We manufactured this for a special order. Twin-milled copper, 16-tooth micro gear, made to accommodate a narrow oscillation range. It was part of a larger request, custom job." "Do you recall the purchaser?" "I do not forget such orders," Blay said with a touch of pride. "It was only 6 weeks ago, a gentleman with a pale complexion, tall, with hair greying at the temples. He spoke with education, but with a tone most impatient." "Did he give a name?" Holmes asked. "No, he left only an address for delivery, which I found curious, an empty commercial building in Bloomsbury, paid in gold sovereigns and quite handsomely." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Would you recognize him again?" "I believe I would." Holmes laid down a sovereign as thanks, and we took our leave. The moment we stepped into the street, he hailed a cab. "To the Langford estate?" I asked. "No," Holmes said, already climbing in. "To Scotland Yard. I must request that Lestrade obtain the lease records for that Bloomsbury property. If our man is who I believe him to be, he has left a footprint." As the cab jostled over the cobbles, Holmes sat back and closed his eyes. "Let us consider the facts, Watson. We have a rival inventor, Alaric Venn, who was once partnered with Langford and claims to have severed all connection. Yet rare components appear in Langford's automaton that were purchased recently, not during the original construction period." "Then you believe Venn gained access to the automaton after it was completed?" "Precisely. And further, I believe he altered it in such a way as to create these so-called predictions, knowing full well their effect upon both Langford and the public imagination. Langford's final journal entries reflect confusion, even fear. That is the work of a man who no longer trusts his own creation. The question now is what Venn seeks to gain." "Fame," I suggested, "or revenge? Perhaps both. But such men rarely settle for mere vindication. They seek the stage, the spotlight. I believe Venn is not yet finished. The prophet has already predicted 2 public events. A third, if timed well, could send the city into hysteria. Especially, Holmes added grimly, if that prophecy reaches the Crown. The cab turned east, and Holmes resumed his thoughtful silence. I could tell from the stiffness of his posture and the gleam in his eye that the game had begun in earnest, and that the stakes, whatever they were, had only just revealed their depth. Chapter 7, Prediction number 3. It was just past 9 o'clock when a sharp knock at the door interrupted our breakfast. Holmes, who had been unusually quiet that morning, rose and opened it himself. A uniformed boy stood on the step, cap in hand, and presented a small envelope sealed in violet wax. Holmes tore it open and scanned the contents with narrowed eyes. A third prophecy, Holmes said, passing me the slip. I read the message aloud, my voice unsteady. The crown shall weep in Windsor's shadow. For a long moment the room was silent, save for the ticking of the mantel clock. Holmes turned away, his face impassive. It was delivered not by post, but by special courier from Mrs. Langford. She found it printed upon the floor beside the automaton early this morning. No sound was heard in the night, yet the tape was fresh and warm to the touch when she discovered it. Holmes, I said quietly, this could be nothing else but a reference to the Queen. Holmes nodded once. Indeed, Watson, the phrase is unmistakable. The crown does not weep lightly, and Windsor casts a long shadow. I rose at once. We must inform the authorities. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. No, Watson, not the Yard. This requires discretion. We must speak to Mycroft. Within the hour we had made our way to the Diogenes Club, that most peculiar of institutions where silence was valued above all other civilities, and conversation was reserved for the stranger's room alone. Holmes's elder brother Mycroft sat in his usual armchair beneath the tall window, immaculately dressed, his portly frame settled like a man carved into the furniture by long habit. Without rising, he raised an eyebrow as we approached. "You are early, Sherlock," he said, setting aside his copy of the Pall Mall Gazette. "And you are troubled. The combination bodes poorly for the nation." Holmes wasted no time. He passed the slip of ticker tape across the table. Mycroft read it, then folded it once and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. "How serious?" he asked. Holmes leaned forward. "Serious enough to warrant quiet precaution. The automaton has predicted 2 events already, both seemingly improbable. If this third prophecy is more than performance, then it suggests an attack upon the Queen. Perhaps not at Windsor itself, but close enough to justify the illusion." Mycroft considered this, his fingers steepled before him. "Have you identified the origin of the machine's manipulation?" "I have strong suspicions. Dr. Alaric Venn. He had access to similar components, motive against Langford, and knowledge of the machine's design. Whether he works alone, I cannot yet say." Mycroft rang a bell, and within seconds a discreet attendant entered. "See that the relevant parties are notified. Increased presence at Windsor. Quietly, no papers, no panic. Use the church security rota if necessary. Tell Sir Wilmot he is to prepare for a state function and treat it accordingly." The man bowed and left. Mycroft turned back to us, more heavily than before. "You understand," he said to Holmes, "that if this is merely a charade, your name will bear the brunt of it." Holmes gave the faintest smile. "If it is a charade, brother, then we need only follow the wire to the hand that pulls it." We returned to Baker Street just past noon. Holmes paced the sitting room like a caged animal, occasionally stopping to make a note in his journal or examine the Langford manuscript. At last he spoke. 3 predictions. The first foretold death, the second injury, the third speaks of mourning. Each has grown in scale and public consequence. The first startled a widow, the second made a headline, and the third may shake the throne if allowed to pass unchallenged. He paused at the window and looked out at the street below. We are no longer hunting a saboteur of machines, Watson. We are now hunting a saboteur of minds, one who uses science not to enlighten but to mystify. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. And he is very nearly convincing. Chapter 8. The Electric Seance. The evening fog clung to the rooftops like gauze as Holmes and I made our way to Dr. Alaric Venn's laboratory on Giltspur Street. The building itself was a former warehouse, its high windows now obscured by drawn curtains and the dull flicker of electric lamps within. Holmes had received an invitation by messenger earlier that day, scrawled in Venn's angular hand and sealed with crimson wax. It read, "You are invited to witness an advance in spiritual instrumentation. Tonight, at the 9th hour." "It is no coincidence," Holmes had muttered, folding the paper, "that this summons arrives not 24 hours after the third prophecy. He wishes us to see his performance, perhaps even admire it." Inside the laboratory was a theatre of curiosities. Glass tubes and brass coils lined the shelves, and strange instruments buzzed faintly under the current of a humming dynamo in the corner. "My friends," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "I welcome you to the threshold of understanding. For centuries, man has asked whether the veil between life and death can be pierced. Tonight, I submit to you, not ghosts, nor trickery, but proof." The apparatus revealed was both magnificent and grotesque. A seated figure, not unlike Langford's automaton, constructed of polished brass and mahogany. Its face was smoother than Langford's model, but the resemblance was unmistakable. Domed skull, glassy eyes, and the parted lips of a mouth shaped for mechanical speech. A ribbon of paper fed from a spool at its chest, its edge already curled like a serpent's tongue. Holmes leaned toward me and whispered, "The same speech mechanism. He has duplicated it precisely, though with modifications for effect. Observe the phonograph cylinders embedded at the throat." Venn raised his hands theatrically. "This is the oracle," he intoned. "It requires no medium. It speaks not by spirits, but by resonance, amplifying the unseen thoughts that linger in the ether. Tonight we ask it one question." Slowly the mouth began to move as well. A rasping, hollow voice issued forth, not natural, not human, but chilling in its approximation. "You are watched, Sherlock Holmes." A murmur rippled through the audience. Holmes remained motionless. The tape continued to print, and Venn held it aloft dramatically. "A response from the void," he said. "Do you doubt it, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes stepped forward calmly. "I doubt only what relies on theatre to establish truth. Your oracle bears a remarkable resemblance to Langford's prophet, too remarkable in fact." Venn's smile did not waver. "We worked in similar fields, and I make no apology for improvement. Langford built a calculator. I have created a listener." Holmes examined the base of the machine. "May I?" Venn hesitated, then stepped aside. Holmes crouched and peered into the chassis. His fingers brushed the wires and he tapped lightly at the structure. "No dust," he said quietly. "These parts were recently installed. The wiring is newer than the frame. This machine was assembled in haste." Venn stiffened. "I assure you it functions." "Oh, it functions, but not as you claim. The messages are prepared. The sound is triggered by proximity sensors or pressure switches. There is no mystery here, only misdirection." The room had gone very still. One of the ladies rose to leave, and the rest followed her lead in polite but hurried silence. Within moments, only Holmes, Venn, and I remained in the hall. "You forget," Holmes said, straightening, "that I have already seen the original machine. Langford's design was subtle, yours is theatrical, but both share a common truth. They speak only what is fed to them." Venn's eyes darkened. "What are you implying?" "That the third prediction," Holmes said, drawing the tape from his pocket, "was no accident. You planted it. You knew we would come, and you wanted to watch us fear what you had created." Holmes took a step forward. "But what you may not know is this. The security at Windsor has already been increased. Your prophecy will not come to pass." Venn's lips parted as if to respond, but Holmes turned away. "Good night, Doctor," he said, and we left him standing beside his mechanical ghost. As we walked back into the lamplit streets, I turned to Holmes. "Do you think he means to try again?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "I think he believes the world will be made to fear him, if not by prophecy, then by design, and I fear he has not yet played his final move." Chapter 9. The Forger of Fate. It was a grey, unsettled morning when Holmes returned from the archives of the Metropolitan Police with a sheaf of papers tucked beneath his arm and an expression of grim satisfaction upon his face. I had just settled into my breakfast when he entered the sitting room at Baker Street and tossed his coat across the back of a chair. "You were correct to be uneasy, Watson," he said, placing the documents upon the table. The Langford estate employed a temporary technician 2 weeks prior to the inventor's death. The man signed in under the name Mr. Alvin Groves, supposedly sent to service the telegraph connections in Langford's laboratory. He remained on the property for 3 afternoons, unobserved, unchallenged, and departed without requesting payment. "Do we know who he was?" I asked, setting down my fork. "Groves does not exist," Holmes replied. "The name is fictitious, but the physical description provided by the gardener matches Venn precisely, down to the greying temples and narrow build. He gained access to the house not by force but by disguise, the perfect crime for a man who traffics in illusions." He paced as he spoke, his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "It explains everything. The prophet was never prophetic. It was a puppet, its strings pulled by a man with knowledge of the machine's inner workings and a mind steeped in vengeance. Venn returned to Langford's estate under false pretenses and modified the automaton to produce ambiguous yet alarming messages, carefully timed, gradually escalating. The death of Langford was the first casualty, though whether by fright or by design remains uncertain. "But why?" I asked. "What could he hope to gain from such theatrics?" "Diversion," Holmes said simply. "A ruse of national scale. By invoking the language of prophecy, Venn sought to generate public hysteria. The first message disturbed a widow, the second made headlines, the third reached the ears of the Queen's own household, and in doing so it pulled eyes and resources toward Windsor." I sat forward. "Then you believe there is a separate, real threat, one not predicted but planned?" "Precisely. While the court prepared for a phantasmal attack in the royal countryside, Venn could operate in the city, unwatched, unnoticed. I have reason to believe that an event of political significance is set to occur within the next 48 hours, and that Venn intends to strike not from the shadows but from beneath the very spotlight he has so carefully drawn." Holmes retrieved a final sheet from the papers and laid it before me. It was a purchase ledger from a discreet but reputable supplier of electrical components and scientific glassware in Marylebone. The most recent order was signed under the name G. Ashcroft, another pseudonym, but the delivery had been made to a locked storeroom at the Royal Exhibition Hall in Kensington. "The Exhibition Hall?" I said, startled. "But the science conference begins tomorrow. Dignitaries, government officials, even members of the royal family," Holmes added softly. "A perfect theatre for a man who believes himself both performer and prophet." He stood abruptly and moved to the window, drawing back the curtain to peer down at Baker Street. Venn's obsession with Langford was not born solely of jealousy, Watson. It was ambition, thwarted by obscurity. Langford gained recognition, while Venn remained an anonymous eccentric. Now he seeks to reverse that fortune by manufacturing fear and revealing himself as the man behind the mask. He turned from the window, his eyes sharp. "We must reach the exhibition hall before he makes his final move. If I am correct, the prophet has served its purpose. The next demonstration will not be mechanical." As he spoke, a knock sounded from downstairs. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a telegram. Holmes opened it swiftly. His eyes scanned the lines and his jaw tightened. "It is from Mycroft. The Queen will attend the exhibition's opening address after all. The change was made in secret, known only to a few, and yet the information has been compromised." He looked to me. "It is time we paid a visit to the hall. Bring your revolver, Watson. The next prophecy will be written not in ink but in blood." Chapter 10. The Manuscript Recovered. The rain returned in earnest that evening, soaking the cobblestones and casting a dull sheen across the city's rooftops. Holmes and I had spent the better part of the afternoon at the exhibition hall, inspecting the storerooms and speaker platforms under the guise of preparing a last-minute scientific exhibit. While no device was yet discovered, Holmes had marked a suspicious electrical conduit leading beneath the main dais. It was nearing dusk when a knock at the door of Baker Street brought further illumination. Lestrade stood upon the threshold, soaked and irritated, but with a look of satisfaction on his pinched face. "We've had our eye on Venn's lodging off Museum Street," he said, stepping inside and unwrapping his scarf. "You were right about him. He fled the premises an hour ago, but left in a terrible rush, papers scattered, drawers half pulled. We gathered what we could. One item in particular may be of interest." He withdrew a folded sheet from within his coat and handed it to Holmes. It was torn along the left edge, stained with oil in one corner, and unmistakably written in the same narrow, slanting hand as Langford's other journal entries. Holmes carried it to the desk, laid it flat, and read silently. I stood beside him, reading over his shoulder. March 3rd. The prophet has begun printing phrases I did not code. I have double-checked the brass relays and adjusted the selector drum, but still it forms sentences not of my making. Yesterday it printed, "It begins at Windsor." I have never entered that phrase. I fear someone has tampered with the prophet. I cannot prove it, not yet. But I have built a fail-safe. I have installed a magnetic stop lever disguised among the cooling coils. If set to the leftmost notch, the machine will cease speech entirely. Let none but myself know of this. At the bottom of the page was a final note, hastily scrawled. "They want to turn prophecy into murder. If I am gone, look to the prophet's mouth." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he drew a breath and looked to Lestrade. "Was this among Langford's personal papers?" "No," Lestrade replied. "It was folded into a notebook marked with Venn's initials. I believe he meant to destroy it, but either forgot or was interrupted." Holmes folded the sheet carefully and placed it into a leather folio. "This confirms it. Langford knew something was amiss, possibly days before his death. He was frightened but logical. He constructed a means to disable the machine, and Venn, fearing discovery, removed the evidence. But he kept the page. Why? Perhaps for study, I suggested, or to find the fail-safe himself. Possibly, Holmes said, or perhaps he could not bring himself to destroy the last written words of the man whose work he had twisted. He turned back to the fire and stared into the flames. "The machine is only the stage, Watson. The performance is elsewhere. But this paper is our key. At that moment, another knock came. This time it was a uniformed officer, breathless and holding a second message from Mycroft. Holmes opened it and frowned. Unusual electrical activity detected in rear circuit panel, exhibition hall. Possible tampering. Entrance tunnels under guard. Queen's appearance confirmed for noon tomorrow. Holmes turned sharply. Then it is tomorrow. Venn has timed his final performance to coincide with Her Majesty's presence. The automaton's predictions were not simply riddles, they were the overture. The tragedy has been composed. The curtain is about to rise. What now? I asked. Holmes straightened his coat. We return to Langford's machine. If the fail-safe still functions, we disable it. If not, we dismantle it. Either way, the prophet shall speak no more lies. Then we go to the exhibition and we stop Venn, not as an inventor, but as a murderer dressed in the robes of a visionary. Chapter 11. The Royal Trap. The dawn of the following day broke with a sharp, pale light that seemed to set the rooftops of London aflame. Holmes had slept scarcely a wink, and I myself had only managed a few broken hours of rest. We breakfasted in silence, both preoccupied by the weight of what lay ahead. The Queen's scheduled appearance at the exhibition was set for noon. If Holmes's deductions were correct, and they often were, it would be the climax of Venn's orchestrated terror. Yet it was not to the exhibition hall that we first set out, but rather to Windsor itself. As our train sped westward through the early mist, I questioned Holmes on the change of plan. "Why Windsor?" I asked. "Surely the exhibition is where we must take our stand." Holmes shook his head. "That is precisely what Venn wants us to believe. He planted the idea of danger at Windsor, not simply to draw security there, but to test whether the Queen's schedule could be diverted. When it could not, he knew the real threat must be elsewhere, but if we now feed him what he expects, an emergency relocation of the Queen to Windsor, he will respond, and when he does, we shall be waiting." Upon arrival, Holmes presented forged telegrams to palace officials, drafted with the help of Mycroft's contacts, indicating that the Queen would make a brief, private appearance at St. George's Chapel to honour an impromptu remembrance service. The chapel was made to appear hastily prepared, guards posted with ceremonial formality, and a closed carriage brought in under a modest veil of secrecy. The public, of course, was told nothing. Holmes and I took up positions in the chapel's rear gallery, overlooking the nave through the carved wooden screen. Lestrade and two plainclothes men waited near the cloisters. At the centre of the decoy procession stood a woman in mourning dress, face obscured by a heavy veil, escorted by two aides in royal livery. She was no monarch, of course, but an actress from the Haymarket Theatre paid handsomely for her morning's work. Her carriage had arrived under full police watch, drawing the attention of the underground whisper network Venn so cleverly manipulated. We waited. It was just past 12 when the assassin came. He entered quietly through the side transept, dressed as a clergyman, and carrying a leather satchel beneath his robes. Holmes, peering through a brass spyglass, stiffened. "There," he murmured. The satchel, too heavy for a Bible, left hand gloved, right hand bare, likely for precise handling of a mechanism. Without another word, Holmes descended the gallery stairs, motioning silently to Lestrade. I followed closely behind. The man reached beneath his robes, pulling forth a narrow device with a brass nozzle and a curious coil of wire. But before he could raise it, Lestrade and I sprang upon him from either side, knocking the strange contraption to the flagstones. Holmes wrested the satchel from his arm and yanked back the assassin's collar, revealing a clean-shaven, angular face with a pale scar under one eye. The man struggled briefly, then slumped as Lestrade clapped irons on his wrists. "I know this one," Holmes said grimly. "His name is Emil Kraus, German by birth, Swiss by trade. former assistant to Venn during his Zurich lectures. We returned to London by 3 o'clock, the prisoner secured under guard. Holmes said little during the journey. His fingers drummed against the edge of the window frame as the city rose again from the distance. "It is almost finished," he said at last. "The final performance is tomorrow. Venn will appear before the scientific world as a visionary, but he will not speak. He will be unmasked." He looked at me, eyes glinting with anticipation. "Langford built a machine to explore thought. Venn built one to exploit it. Tomorrow, we dismantle both." Chapter 12. The Prophet Silenced. The Royal Scientific Exhibition opened under bright skies and brass fanfare, with ministers and academics crowding the marbled halls of the Kensington Pavilion. Among the exhibits stood a curious contraption that drew more than its fair share of attention. A brass figure, seated and motionless, its eyes of glass staring blankly toward the far wall. Holmes and I arrived early, accompanied by 2 constables and Lestrade in plain clothes. Dr. Alaric Venn had been granted a prime speaking slot, directly following a lecture on magnetic resonance. He stood backstage beside the automaton, dressed in a crisp black coat and pale cravat, a calm smile upon his face. He did not see us until it was too late. Holmes approached him slowly, and Venn's smile faltered. "Mr. Holmes," he said, voice low, "I trust you are here to witness a revelation." "I am indeed," Holmes replied, gesturing to Lestrade. "Though not the one you intend." Before Venn could react, the constables stepped forward. Lestrade drew a paper from his coat. "Dr. Alaric Venn," he announced, "you are hereby charged with conspiracy to commit murder, attempted regicide, and the fraudulent manipulation of scientific instruments for public harm." Venn made no attempt to flee. His gaze swept the crowd as though expecting disbelief, perhaps even applause, but the only response was silence. He was taken quietly, and his machine was wheeled onto the stage. It was Holmes who took the podium next. Though not listed in the programme, the hall had grown curious, and the gathered crowd lent him its full attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "you see before you what has been called a marvel, a prophet, even a voice from beyond. But I tell you now, it is none of those things." He gestured to the automaton. This machine was built not to foresee the future, but to shape it through deception. Its messages were prepared, its voice manipulated. Each so-called prediction was planted by human hands, by a man who wished not to reveal truth but to obscure it. The illusion of intelligence was used as a veil for dangerous ambition. There was a murmuring among the crowd. A professor in the front row frowned and whispered to his neighbour. Holmes continued. Its creator, Elias Langford, sought to explore the limits of mechanical logic. His rival, Dr. Venn, sought to use it as a stage for his own ascendancy. When Langford discovered the tampering, he feared not the machine, but the man behind it. He left behind a warning, one that we were fortunate to recover in time. Holmes bent to the machine and pulled a small lever beneath its brass casing. The automaton gave a weak click, then fell silent. "Thus ends its prophecy," Holmes said, "not in mystery but in truth." The room broke into scattered applause, though it was the restrained applause of minds reassured rather than amazed. Rationality, Holmes had once said, was not thrilling, but it was trustworthy. We departed before the exhibition had closed. Holmes lit his pipe as we walked through the evening crowd, silent for some time. Then he said quietly, "He might have succeeded, you know. A lesser man would have been hailed as a genius. A more reckless one might have plunged us into chaos." "He was both," I replied. Holmes nodded. "Indeed. There is a thin line, Watson, between vision and delusion." Langford's genius asked questions. Ven's ambition demanded answers, no matter the cost. He turned his eyes to the smoke curling above the rooftops. There will be more like him. The future is fertile ground for charlatans who dress superstition in the garb of science. We must be vigilant. The mind, like the machine, must be watched closely when it claims to speak for fate. And as we returned to Baker Street, I found myself reflecting on the strange brass face of the prophet, lifeless now, silenced and still. A hollow shell, animated once by false hope and darker schemes. The world would remember the spectacle, but we, who stood close enough to see the levers move, would remember something more enduring. Epilogue. In the weeks that followed, the prophet was dismantled and consigned to the archives of the Royal Society, where it was studied not as a marvel, but as a caution. Venn, tried in secret under charges of conspiracy, was declared sane but dangerously obsessed. He would live out his remaining years in quiet confinement, his name gradually erased from scientific circles. Elias Langford's widow, grateful but subdued, bequeathed her late husband's journals and prototypes to the University of Edinburgh, where they were treated with the dignity his work deserved. A modest brass plaque now marks his name in the School of Mechanical Philosophy, noting his contributions to logic-based computation and early automatons. As for Holmes, he returned to his violin and his chemistry experiments, seemingly unaffected by the stir. But I noticed from time to time a new kind of vigilance in his manner, a sharpened eye for machines that imitated man too closely, and a wary tone when confronted with claims too grand for proof. And though the prophet was gone, its shadow lingered in our minds, a reminder that even in an age of reason, belief may be shaped, twisted, and sold. The future, we learned, is not always built by those who understand it best, but often by those willing to deceive in its name. And so concludes the manuscript of the Mechanical Prophet, a tale in which science was wielded not to enlighten, but to mislead. Thanks to Holmes's unshakable logic, the illusion was exposed and a plot against the crown quietly undone. Though the machine has been silenced, its legacy serves as a warning that unchecked ambition, when cloaked in reason, can be as dangerous as any criminal. Thank you for joining us at the Drawing Room Detectives. Until our next case, keep your lanterns lit, your notebooks open, and your mind ever curious.